Okay, folks, before we do any more on constructions, I thought I would get you guys to talk a little bit about what you did for the exercise last night. So, I personally think this is something which is near to my heart, so to speak, that I really want to make FrameNet more useful for cognitive linguists. And so this exercise is also me using you as slave labor. I hope you don't mind too much. It's for a good cause. I really will be taking your ideas seriously. I'm going to be reading all of these. That's true for all of the homework. And I have seen a lot of good ideas in the homework that people have turned in. And I'm sorry that I haven't had time to give you comments on everything yet. But the site will still be up even after the lectures are over, and there will still be information coming from me. So don't despair if you've gotten nothing back from me yet. There will still be some coming later. Okay, so now we're going to discuss ideas about how to make FrameNet a little bit more cognitively oriented. So I'm looking for volunteers first. Ooh, we have a volunteer. Excellent.
I'm going to try to explain what I have thought because I work in the World Cup dictionary and I was thinking about something that comprises the approach that we do in the dictionary, okay? And I don't know if my examples are correct because I made up them, okay? I thought about an example which is John is full of anger. Is it possible?
Yes.
Full of anger.
Perfectly fine.
So I think this example does not instantiate only the frame of emotion directed, which is a frame that is annotated in FrameNet. And it does not instantiate only the frame of fullness as well. So I think we could have a metaphorical frame. I don't know, maybe the name could be feeling emotion. I don't know, because we have a person, normally, which is full in the example of some emotion or feeling. And I thought this because on the dictionary, we have to pay attention to the soccer vocabulary and the World Cup. And we have a lot of expressions, which is, how can I say, idioms, like we used to say, to be in the tub.
To be in the top, yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if it's...
In English it works too, yeah.
So it's metaphorical. So how would you explain this in the dictionary? Sorry. By annotating how you do in FrameNet. So I thought we could made up a frame, you know, a metaphorical frame, which is composed by some characteristics of the frame emotion directed and the frame of fullness. Okay? So there are other examples, but they are similar to the first, like Mary is full of love with Jim. Is it possible to say that she's very in
love
love?
Jim.
For Jim. Okay.
That's the only change, but everything else is fine.
That's it.
Okay. So that was actually, I think, two proposals. One about this emotion fullness, and the other one about how to annotate in the top. At least you mentioned both of those. In general, I would say that both of those are certainly metaphorical cases that we should have an analysis for in FrameNet. What I would say is that at least in the case of in the top, we actually, The only thing we need to add is the metaphor part, because it's a productive metaphor, meaning that I would annotate it in a locative relation frame, and top would be annotated in the region by orientation frame. So those two are okay. Then I do need to separately, outside of FrameNet or connected with FrameNet somehow, we're still working on how to do that, describe what the metaphor is that maps spatial position to quality, or in your case, spatial position specifically to soccer ranking, which is, I would say, entangled with the idea of quality, best to worst, right? So the two cases I would actually handle differently. The reason why is because, especially in the case of full, there's a subset of the cases which you might be able to describe with a productive metaphor. So the case of full, there's also overflowing in English. So you have a cup and there's too much liquid in there. So you can also use that to describe emotions. So there is a general metaphor. It's actually pretty well described in Women, Fire, and Dangerous Things, that metaphor. And we have already put that metaphor in our database of metaphors that we are building. But there's a problem because some of the vocabulary related to that is lexically idiosyncratic. So we use the preposition with to express the thing which is too much, the thing which exceeds some standard, and that is fine if we have an overt word like overflowing with love, or you can also say filled with love. But then if you say something like, he shivered with fear, then that's using the same general idea of the fear being so much that it causes shivering, but we will need to make a frame like the one you're talking about.
Yes, because I tried to find a way to augment the definition of a frame as you asked us to do, but I couldn't find, you know, a way to put what I was what I was thinking, and I thought we could made up a frame, you know, which is between the frames I was thinking before.
Yeah, we'll talk about that some more later. I think in this case there's probably is a way to more or less handle it with our normal process. But of course, that all assumes that you have a database of frames, a database of metaphors. And we haven't talked in this class about how we would do that in detail, in part because we're still fighting about that in our project. I could call it discussing, but that might sort of oversell the idea of concord. Actually, there's a lot of conflict. Okay, so does anybody else want to discuss an idea? Okay.
As Juliana said, I take part in this project of the World Cup, and I try to think about something related to soccer. So within that soccer scene, I managed to consider a metaphor that a soccer game is a war. So I try to find a frame that I could instantiate this to profile the situation of war. So I thought of the frame invading, for instance. There is the definition here. The invader tries to invade a lot in order to paralyze its government and its people. The examples that were there were related to this war event. So within our corpus, I took 3 examples. I'll mention just 2 here with this LU invade. So Andras Iniesta that had some chances to invade the Netherlands area. So he received a step from Fabregas that didn't kicked Stefan Borg on the penalty area. So we have Iniesta, which will be the invader I marked here. So, and then the terrain, the area that was invaded with, which was the Netherlands area. So at the end of the game, the cheers invaded the Wembley Stadium grass in order to celebrate the winning of the game. So there are some other lexical units inside soccer that would allow us to implement these things such as bomb and kicked a ball like a bomb, like the one who goaled more to attack and counter-attack. So there are some more Alexa units that gives us this idea of soccer as war. So I've tried to associate these 2 things. I don't know if this is correct.
So what I would say is that, so I speculate, at least, that this is again a productive metaphor. It seems to be. And it has been analyzed as a productive metaphor. So again, I don't think we would need a special frame. But I do think that we would need to be explicit about the metaphor that's involved. I mean, that one is... that metaphor is described in Lakoff's work. I'm trying to even remember which place is the most up-to-date one. But you know, certainly competition is war is well articulated in a bunch of places. So really, I mean, for both of the questions that I've had so far, or the suggestions, the main question is really how do we integrate a productive metaphor description with the frames. And it's really clear that we want to, one part of that is going to be making the metaphor descriptions refer explicitly to the frames in FrameNet. And that we're already doing. But that's all on the metaphor description side, not on the augmenting FrameNet side, at least as we have decided to do it. One could try to include the metaphors themselves in FrameNet, but it's very hard to see how to do that for lexical constructions. If you put it in the constructicon, then it's easier to see how it would fit. Because the whole point of a productive metaphor is that it's not about which word you use. I can make a new word which is about attack. Let's say Zorch. And this new word which is about physical attacking could also be used to describe a game, right? So we don't want to describe it at the lexical level. We want to describe it at the semantic level. And it's harder for us to do that in FrameNet. So it would be possible for us to make a frame for it, but then we wouldn't want to put any lexical units in there. We would want people to do reasoning over our frames, saying, well, every lexical unit which can be used for attack can be used in order to describe a game. So that's still an open question, the best way to do that. Okay?
It's just a comment.
Mm-hmm.
I think Simone thought about a new frame, as I did, because of our work in the dictionary. We have to create the frames, you know, the specific frames.
Yep. So this has come up a bunch of times in this class. The question of, are you taking the semasiological approach or the onomasiological approach? And especially given the nature of the soccer project, the World Cup project that you were on, it's sort of inherently the onomasiological approach, right? You're trying to talk about the language of soccer. And so to the degree that you stick to your guns on that, to the degree that you stick to that idea, then you will be doing something different from the way we do it at FrameNet usually. Because most of the time at FrameNet, we are taking the semasiological approach. So because attack can be used both for both of these things and need anything special about the words, right? I mean, the word attack is used in both ways because there's a productive metaphor. Then we would say, well, just take the attack frame, we have a description, and take the metaphor, and boom. But if you were trying to discuss what actually occurs in soccer, then it's very obvious that you want to be able to describe this. But you still have a choice. You can still describe this as a productive metaphor and annotate in the literal attack frame in your soccer work. But, of course, that means that you have to be very detailed about what the metaphor is, because you do want people to understand what the overall meaning is, for sure. Question over here, or comment?
I was much less creative than the girls. I thought, in the moment I thought, first when you described the task, I thought about the first situation. A metaphoric situation, I thought something like embodied, like regarding our classes. So I thought about emotion, the emotion examples as she did, right? I thought about the metaphor of anger. So the metaphor is anger is heat. It's something that heats inside of us. So body is the content to the emotions. So at this point you can say things like, I can't content your happiness, for example. Starting from this, anger is inside this container, and you have heat associated with anger, and you do something boil inside of you. And some other things like, can we analyze the metaphor of anger using it as main tasks? So when it boils, it goes up. So you can say things like, as much as he was talking, my anger was going up. So it produces a heat and pressure. So there was smoke from your ears. He was almost blowing of anger, things like that. When the pressure goes high, the container can explode. So I'm afraid of your anger explosions. During the explosion, the pieces of the container blows in the air. I believe that this question is very good when we talk about the relation between the embodiment and the questions. It's that you have to harmonize everything in order to understand the emotion itself.
So I will point out that for the exact example that you are giving, we experimentally have a frame called emotion heat. So if you look in FrameNet, there actually is an emotion heat frame, which is exactly talking about, you know, how anger is connected up with the whole idea of heat. One of the reasons why we had to make that frame is because we have a really weird word in English, to seethe, which used to be a verb that meant to boil, but it doesn't mean that anymore. But it still retains the image of boiling even though it's only used for the emotion use. So it's become a lexically idiosyncratic word that is, it lexically demands the metaphor, right? All by itself, it refers to anger, but it refers to anger that is conceived of as a liquid that's trying to boil out. It's a really weird word. It's very rare that metaphors are lexicalized this way, where they don't even have a literal correspondent. I actually only know one other example in FrameNet, and that's to skyrocket, which is what we use to describe when a quantity changes very, very quickly. So for example, I wish I had bought that stock. It skyrocketed just yesterday. So, but that's not used literally, right? The literal objects cannot skyrocket. So you'd think that maybe a rocket would skyrocket, but no. So there are a few cases like that. We actually don't have a good way of representing that in FrameNet. And if you look at the emotion heat frame, it's actually only connected to the emotion family of frames right now. We know that it has all of these connections with more general notions of heat, including pressure and temperature and liquids, all of these things. But we didn't have a way to encode that. We will be adding the relation, the frame-to-frame relation metaphor to handle this case. But then we have the question of whether some of the members of the frame are productive metaphors, whether they're the result of productive metaphors, in which case our policy now would be to handle all of them in the source frame. So there actually are some interesting problems that come up there. But the basic idea would be that probably, according to the policies that we have now, this frame would have only one word in it, seethe, because it's the only word which is lexically idiosyncratically evoking the metaphor. For all the other ones, we would put them somewhere else. Does that make sense? And again, this is because we're using a Semazy logical approach. So, do we have any more comments? Or any other solutions? Any other ideas about cognitivizing FrameNet?
Hi.
Hi.
I think that I didn't understand in another way because my answers is very different. I try to link the frame with some image schemas. For example, the frame protecting.
Protecting, okay.
I link the frame with the image schema container in the sense of the act of protect involves sometimes create a container involving to prevent the contact and between and between the and the asset to choose the frame element names and the gender. Some as involve protect a container.
Yeah.
To avoid the danger. Another example is fragmentation scenario that I linked with the image schema first because the description of frame don't mention force, but we know that is necessary a force to cause the fragmentation. And the list attaching, I linked to image schema contact.
Contact, yeah.
To bring the idea that attaching involves a contact between sometimes some surface that is another image schema. I think in this way, maybe very different of the colleagues.
No, this is, I was looking for any of these things. So I was thinking that most people would probably do what you were talking about, but I was very happy to have metaphor examples too, because both things are aspects of general cognitive science that we don't have as well in FrameNet yet. No, those are definitely appreciated. So anybody else want to talk about their ideas?
I tried to relate our sense of orientation in space with some frames that I chose, two of them that I could find something about, but I'm not sure if it's totally correct. And the frame individual history is a frame it's a scenario that describes a series of events associated with a single participant. And these events occupy a period of time. And I brought a sentence that was in this frame in FrameNet. It is the introduction describes the history of geography from the 18th century onwards. And I could find the same kind of relation to orientation to space that we have in the frame time vector. So I suggested for frames like this that this period of time, the features of this period of time, like start time and end time, could be described as occurring, as this is in the frame time vector, as occurring at a particular distance and in a particular direction from a landmark event. So it's a relation to our orientation in space, I think. And the other one is the frame accomplishment. And there I couldn't find so many sentences, but I choose one that I think it's possible to relate. There is: no one can surpass his economic and financial achievements. So the achievement should be the goal, that's the landmark. So the period between the beginning and the achievement should be understood as a trajectory, and the goal, the landmark. And I also thought about the frame that you said, emotion heat. So I just suggested to describe this frame as a container in a more general way, as Bruno said.
Okay.
So it is.
Okay, no, that's good. And one thing I will comment. In general, one would, if you were looking at the specific proposals that you guys are making, you're making very specific proposals. So some of them we might want to modify in some way. In particular, probably for some of the examples you just gave, we would want to make the relations to some more general frame that the specific frames that you are talking about inherit from. Right? So we wouldn't want to repeat the information about the relationship to the spatial orientation for each frame that's talking about time, right? We probably would want to relate them all to a general frame that does the mapping between space and time, or refers to the mapping between space and time. So that's really the only modification I would make, is that we do definitely need to do what you're talking about. The only difference is I would do it high in the hierarchy instead of low in the hierarchy. Yeah? So thank you. Anybody else?
So, but I'm afraid I've made him with the Portuguese, a Portuguese sentence.
Okay.
And the frame I chose was to wear, vestir. So, in some specific usage of the verb vestir, to wear, we can put on a frame collaboration, colaborar, colaboração. When we say like, João vestiu realmente a camisa da empresa. It would be in Portuguese like, John really put on the company's shirt or clothes, I don't know. We say that, when we say that in Portuguese, we say not that he put on the colors or the uniform, but that he's really interested in defending or fighting for the interests. And what we did was like this, to change the specific frame. Like we check in the FrameNet Brazil, there's no collaboration in this case. And neither, obviously, it wouldn't be in the FrameNet in English, because I believe that this metaphor don't occur in English, I believe.
We would have to change it some. We have something related to wear someone's colors.
Yes, that's what was I thinking of, but
it exists, but it's very specific, and I would not use it to describe a company. So it's only used in politics, in English.
In Portuguese, yes, it's only a person. It must be a person. It must be a company. You can't like vestir a camisa de alguém, because wear someone's shirt, it would be literally.
Yeah, I understand.
So
yep.
I believe it was just a little small addition. I believe it was when you were discussing. I believe, well, I did everything wrong, but I believe it's, I don't know.
It sounds okay. I mean, to me, what it sounds like, I'm not sure I would relate to collaboration frame. It sounds to me more related to bias or something like that. So there's a frame in which you are favoring somebody over somebody else, where you are taking their viewpoint. Is that the right frame, or is it that you're actually working with them?
Yes, you work with them. You are like, I belong to a certain company, and I will do everything to I don't know, to put, I don't know. Yes, to defend the company, like to defend the interests, like to make everything better, everything possible to make the company better, or to decide the best, like, I don't know, the best, I don't know, markets. I'm not really.
I think I understand, and it does sound like it's unique to Portuguese. We can't use it that way in English. So it's definitely an interesting example from that perspective. So to me, that if that's the case, it would be a motivated metaphor that is lexically specific. So you would probably want to list it, as you were saying, in a collaboration frame or something like that. Although I would want to look at just for me to understand it for real, I would need to read a bunch of examples. Because right now, I have an idea, but I don't have a translation. And because I don't have a translation, it leaves me uncertain as to whether I have the right idea.
Okay.
But I think I understand enough to say you're on the right track.
Okay.
Okay.
That's it.
I think we're going to need to move on pretty quick if we want to describe the world of construction grammars.
You have 15 minutes.
15 minutes, okay. So, as I mentioned before, I belong to a particular brand of construction grammar. I'm just going to give you a little diagram here. So we have construction grammar in general, which started with George, this is the first thing that was published. I should be more specific. The first thing published was the case study in Women, Fire, and Dangerous Things. However, there was already a class being taught at Berkeley about this before there was any publication, and it was collaborative between Chuck Fillmore, Paul Kay, and George Lakoff. So this is a product of the confluence of a lot of really smart people coming together at the beginning of this, and then a lot of other really smart people coming up with different ideas about how to use it, or different emphases. So from the root of construction grammar, you get, very quickly, you end up with cognitive construction grammar, otherwise known as the theory of Adele Goldberg. And the thing that, especially as she has developed it over time, the thing that's really noteworthy about it is its connection to psychology. So she has devoted a lot of research to figuring out how to connect up the general idea of construction grammar, which is still the same general idea, to the field of psychology. Then we have sort of a immediate offshoot here. We have what, for lack of a better name, has been called Berkeley construction grammar. Note that Berkeley construction grammar does not include, and never has included, George Lakoff. So you would think, you know, George Lakoff, he's at Berkeley, of course, Berkeley construction, no. Berkeley construction grammar is the product that's further development of Paul Kay and Chuck Fillmore. So this is sort of the thing that I adhere to. And this is the formalism that was used for the, what I consider quite famous, What is X doing Y article that appeared in Language. It uses this formalism. There's also a number of papers, some of which were never published. They're still in the form of sort of class notes from the Berkeley construction grammar seminars. And you can actually find those on Paul Kay's website, which is really easy to find. It's at ICSE, Berkeley, whatever, you know how to spell Berkeley. EDU. Actually, now all of a sudden I'm not completely sure that it's PK. But anyway, sorry about that. I have it bookmarked on every computer that I have, so I don't exactly have to remember it. But I'll send that around to make sure that you guys have the right address. Thiago, do you have wireless or no?
Yes, I do.
Okay.
Want me to check it?
Yeah, that would be great.
Okay. I was just doing it, but
it's slow, yeah. So that strand is very deeply informed by the long tradition of both formal linguistic description and also traditional grammar, which Chuck knows a really amazing amount about. So you can sort of associate this with traditional grammar and just pure description. So the whole idea behind this strand is to give you exactly what you need to generalize exactly the right amount in the way that I was describing earlier today, in the way that we were working through, trying to figure out how to generalize the things that can be generalized. What are the categories? Then this here merged with head-driven phrase structure grammar. It's a terrible name. Also known as HBSG, because who wants to say head-driven phrase structure grammar that many times? So these merged into sign-based construction grammar. So sign-based construction grammar is basically, it uses almost exactly the formalism of head-driven phrase structure grammar. In fact, it's close enough that the programs that were written in order to parse sentences using this kind of grammar could actually work with the new ideas that were put in there for sign-based construction grammar. So basically, the computer science part and the formalism itself mostly comes from this side, but the ideas come from here. Okay?
There is
No PK.
just K.
It's just K.
Yes.
Okay. Sorry about that. So this is a pretty nice formalism as well. It's intimidating when you first look at it, however, because it's oriented for computer people, because it's supposed to actually be the input to a program that can parse real sentences, and it does that. Okay? I will further say, even though it's intimidating to first look at, it really is worth it. But I recommend, if you haven't read the What is X Doing Y article, you should definitely do that before trying to read any paper in this formalism, because it's sort of like training wheels, like you would have on a bicycle. You know, the idea is you should, that article goes through some considerable effort to try to explain why you need each piece all in one place. Whereas in these, they assume a vast background of pieces, none of which are defended in the particular papers usually, and then they add one more piece that they are defending for that paper. So that can be very hard to read. But I have email, and I could be emailed. If you're crazy enough to try to do it, then I will definitely try to support you doing that. There's one more theory that more or less comes directly out of all this, and that's embodied construction grammar. So embodied construction grammar is a collaboration between George Lakoff and a more general cog-sci group with the neural theory of language. So it's a part of the neural theory of language effort to understand how the heck language works from a deeply, deeply cognitive science-oriented methodology. So this group includes all of the people that it should include to be a real cog-sci group. It has linguists, it has psychologists, it has people who do neurological imaging as well. It has philosophers, it has the whole 9 yards. Actually, the one thing it doesn't seem to have, as far as I can tell, and never has, is an anthropologist. And I think that explains some omissions that are there in the group. I know the group very well, I'm a member, although I can apparently be critical of anything. But it's been going for a very long time, and primarily it's run by a fellow from computer science, Jerry Feldman, but it's still a collaboration, although a weaker collaboration now with George Lakoff, because George Lakoff has moved strictly into the metaphor direction, and as far as I can tell, just isn't doing much in the grammar end of things anymore. Okay, a couple more directions. Everything else has a tenuous connection, an indirect connection to the Berkeley construction grammar. One thing is fluid construction grammar. So fluid construction grammar is associated with Sony, and that's no joke. The Sony labs are the people who invented this idea because they wanted to make robots that you could talk to. And so the entire thrust of this construction grammar is to make something that's learnable by a robot just from evidence. So just hearing some other speaker say some stuff, the robot should be able to figure out what it means and make constructions. It does a lot in that direction. There are some things it still can't do, and I don't know how they're going to get it to do that stuff, but they're doing it. Sony has actually sunk a kind of ridiculous amount of money into this effort. And there's some very good people who were associated with that project. It's very much computer programming. So they sort of make a formalism that looks like something a linguist would look at, but it's actually just a mildly transformed computer program. So the main, at least one very big disadvantage of this is that it's not accessible to linguists very well at all. Computational linguists would do fine, but it's actually very hard to read their articles. And they're focused primarily on engineering. They want to do a job. Then we have radical construction grammar, which I should probably put very far to the left, but this is where I have space. Radical construction grammar is associated with Bill Croft. And the main input that doesn't come into the other things is typology. So almost all of these efforts have focused, I'll say, not completely, but focused largely on English. That is not even vaguely true of Bill Croft's radical construction grammar. He is a typologist. He personally knows more languages than anybody else I know. And he also knows about a huge number of languages and includes the typological information in his considerations for how you make construction grammar. I personally consider, of all of these, this one is the one that I do, but of all this other stuff, the thing that I find most useful that isn't already implicit in the construction grammar that I do is here. Because the effort that Bill Croft has put together really does use the same principles that I outlined, including really throwing away any assumptions about what grammar looks like, and you just start from the bottom and say, okay, here's the pattern. What else is like this pattern? Okay, here's another one. Okay, I guess I can put these together this way. And then doing that across a huge number of languages can give you some interesting generalizations, including the fact that there aren't generalizations, practically. And that's a very useful insight for people who do construction grammar, in my opinion. Put slightly less radically, the only generalizations you can make are about meaning. So almost all languages have something which is kind of like nouns. But if you define nouns as those things that refer to entities in the world, well, it's not very surprising that, because there are entities in the world, at least the way that humans think of the world. And so it's not very surprising that there's some special grammar in most languages that surrounds that, because it's a deeply separate category. Same thing goes for verbs. It's not very surprising that we have a special way of dealing with things that are situated in time, that have an event characteristic or a state characteristic. So it really strips away all of the extra stuff and just builds a grammar which is so general that it can do practically anything. And then lets you specify everything that actually needs to be added on top of that yourself for your own language. And that's very much the way I think of construction grammar as working. So I think that's about it for the romp through construction grammars. I will mention that really quite outside of this whole thing, but closer than any other form of grammar, is word grammar, as done by Richard Hudson. And it uses some of the same principles, but it doesn't look the same at all. But if you were ever wanting to expand your ideas about how construction grammar could work, then that is probably where I would look. So now I'm going to open up the floor for questions if people have any. I don't have any exercise for today, but you should definitely anticipate that there will be an exercise tomorrow, because tomorrow we're going to be talking about the Constructicon, and we're going to be talking about how you annotate constructions. So here we're talking about how do you even get around this whole construction idea. Tomorrow we're going to get into the real detail. And you could call this a homework assignment if you like, but I would like each of you to think about some construction in Portuguese that would be interesting to do. And it shouldn't just be an idiom. Idioms are interesting too, but the analysis doesn't end up being very interesting, because you say, okay, you need everything, all of these pieces, and then when you have all these pieces, then you have this meaning. So at least if you have an idiom, think about one that has some, a lot of freedom in some interesting dimension. Either that you can replace this word with anything from this whole chunk of different meaning possibilities, or that there's a slightly more general kind of syntax that's associated with it. So some flexibility on the form side, or some flexibility on the meaning side. We're looking for a Goldilocks condition. It should be not too hot and not too cold. Okay?